May 8, 1945. The thunder of artillery had finally ceased across the Elbe River Valley. In a converted schoolhouse near Torgau, Germany, where American and Soviet forces had clasped hands just 2 weeks prior, a makeshift field hospital operated under dim kerosene lamps. The acrid smell of carbolic acid mingled with the earthier scent of blood-soaked bandages. Schwester Marguerite Hoffmann, a 42-year-old German Red Cross nurse whose hands had not stopped trembling since the surrender, stood in what had once been a children's classroom. Mathematical equations still chalked faintly on the blackboard behind her seemed absurd against the rows of wounded men lying on straw pallets. The walls, painted with cheerful murals of fairy tale castles, now bore the shadows of suffering. She clutched a nearly empty glass vial of sulfanilamide powder, turning it slowly in the pale light filtering through shattered windows. Outside, American jeeps rumbled past, their engines a constant mechanical heartbeat. She had been told the Americans were coming to inspect the facility. She expected confiscation. She expected retribution. She expected the cold arithmetic of Victor's justice. What she never expected was the cardboard box that would arrive 3 hours later, stamped with a red cross and filled with more sulfa drugs than she had seen in the previous 18 months of war combined. The story of that box, and thousands like it, begins not in the ashes of Nazi Germany, but in the fundamental philosophical chasm that separated two visions of civilization. For Marguerite and millions like her, the concept of enemy care had been systematically eroded by 12 years of National Socialist indoctrination. The regime's medical establishment had transformed healing into an instrument of racial hierarchy. Doctors took oaths not to Hippocrates but to the health of the Volk. Resources were allocated not by need but by perceived genetic value. The T4 program had murdered 70,000 disabled Germans before its official cessation in 1941, though the killings continued in quieter forms throughout the war. By 1945, the average German nurse had witnessed medical triage reduced to ideological mathematics. Aryans received care, Slavs received minimal treatment, Jews received deportation. The sulfa drugs, those miraculous white crystals that could halt sepsis and save limbs from amputation, had become scarcer than morphine in the final year of war. Marguerite had learned to ration them with brutal precision, calculating not just medical urgency but political value. A Wehrmacht officer's infected wound received sulfanilamide. A foreign laborer with identical symptoms received only prayers and clean water. The German medical establishment had itself pioneered sulfonamide research before the war. Gerhard Domach's 1935 discovery of Prontosil, the first commercially available antibacterial sulfonamide, had earned him the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1939, though the Nazi government forbade him from accepting it. The irony would later prove profound. German pharmaceutical giant IG Farben had manufactured sulfa drugs throughout the war, yet by 1944, the systematic Allied bombing of chemical plants and the Reich's chaotic distribution networks meant frontline medical units operated in a state of perpetual scarcity. Nurses like Marguerite had watched men die of infected wounds that could have been prevented with a gram of sulfanilamide powder. She had held the hands of 19-year-old soldiers whose minor shrapnel wounds transformed into gangrenous nightmares because no drugs remained. The vials she hoarded were reserved for officers, for party officials, for those deemed valuable to the collapsing state apparatus. The ethical compromises became routine. Necessity, she told herself, bred pragmatism. Survival demanded hierarchy. These were the lies she recited as she walked past dying men whose only crime was insufficient rank. What Marguerite could not have known, standing in that May morning light with her near-empty vial, was that the American Medical Corps approaching her hospital operated under a radically different moral framework. The United States had entered the war with its medical infrastructure intact and its industrial capacity unmatched. By 1943, American pharmaceutical companies were producing 50,000 pounds of sulfa drugs monthly, enough to supply not just American forces but Allied armies across multiple theaters. The Winthrop Chemical Company, Merck, Abbott Laboratories, and others had ramped up production under War Production Board contracts that guaranteed both profit and patriotic purpose. The cost of sulfanilamide had dropped from dollars per gram to pennies. What had been a scarce miracle became an abundant standard. American G's carried individual sulfa packets in their first aid kits, small paper envelopes containing enough white powder to treat a wound immediately upon injury. The military's forward-thinking policy mandated that every soldier could self-administer this life-saving treatment, a democratization of medicine unthinkable in the hierarchical German system. But abundance alone does not explain what happened in thousands of German hospitals in the weeks following surrender. Abundance does not account for American medics treating enemy wounded with the same urgency they afforded their own. Abundance does not capture the moment when Captain James Morrison of the 102nd Medical Battalion overrode Marguerite's stuttered protests and ordered his men to unload their entire surplus sulfa stock into her dispensary. The explanation lies deeper, in the bedrock assumptions about human dignity that separated American democracy from fascist ideology. The Geneva Conventions, which Nazi Germany had signed but selectively ignored, were not mere suggestions to the American military. They were operational doctrine. Article 15 required that wounded and sick prisoners of war receive care equivalent to that provided to the captor nation's forces. American medical officers took this seriously not because regulations demanded it, but because their cultural framework insisted upon it. The belief that all human beings possessed inherent worth, regardless of nationality or ideology, was not propaganda. It was practiced policy. In the days following May 8th, as Marguerite watched American medical teams work, she confronted a cognitive dissonance that shattered her remaining assumptions. She had expected cruelty mirroring what she had witnessed from her own side. She had seen how German forces treated Soviet prisoners, starving them systematically in camps where death rates exceeded 50%. She knew what had happened in the hospitals of occupied Poland, where German doctors conducted experiments on prisoners and withheld care as a matter of course. The projection of her own side's behavior onto the enemy seemed rational. Instead, she observed Captain Morrison, a 34-year-old surgeon from Minnesota, amputating the gangrenous leg of an SS officer with the same meticulous care he had shown treating an American sergeant earlier that morning. She watched as American medics distributed sulfa packets to German posts with infected wounds, demonstrating proper application techniques through interpreters. She witnessed the arrival of penicillin shipments, that even more miraculous drug that remained largely unavailable to German forces, being used to treat pneumonia in German civilians at the hospital. The Americans did not segregate care by rank. They did not calculate ideological worthiness. They tried by medical need alone. The transformation was not immediate. Trust does not bloom in the soil of collapsed tyranny without first being cultivated by consistent action. But over the subsequent weeks, as American supplies continued flowing into German medical facilities, a subtle shift occurred. Marguerite began to understand that the box of sulfa drugs was not an aberration but a principle in action. The Americans were not being naive. They were being deliberate. The medical care extended to enemy wounded and civilians was a form of ideological warfare more powerful than propaganda leaflets. It demonstrated through concrete action what democracy meant in practice. It showed that a society committed to human rights extended those rights even to former enemies. This was not weakness. It was strength of conviction so profound that it could withstand the bitterness of war. The symbolic power of sulfanilamide in this context cannot be overstated. Those small white crystals, so chemically simple yet so medically revolutionary, became a physical manifestation of contrasting philosophies. In German hands, they had been hoarded, rationed by racial calculus, denied to the unworthy. In American hands, they became tools of universal care. The drug itself was neutral, but its distribution told stories about the societies that produced and used it. Every gram of American sulfa powder sprinkled into a German soldier's wound was a small repudiation of Nazi ideology. It said, "Your leaders lied to you. They told you that strength came from purity, from hierarchy, from ruthless selection. But here is strength of another kind. Here is abundance born from democratic capitalism and deployed through humanitarian principle. Here is medicine that does not ask about your beliefs before it heals your body. The medical records from the American occupation zones in 1945 reveal the scale of this effort. The European Theater Medical Service treated over 300,000 German prisoners of war in the immediate post-surrender period, with mortality rates far lower than those in German-run facilities during the war. American field hospitals established in former German military installations received continuous resupply of sulfa drugs, penicillin, plasma, and surgical equipment. The 128th Evacuation Hospital near Munich, operating in what had been a Luftwaffe base, reported treating both American G.I.s and German civilians with identical protocols. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Edwards, chief nurse of the unit, wrote in her diary of the initial skepticism from German medical staff who could not comprehend why Americans would expend valuable resources on enemy populations. She described the gradual transformation as German nurses like Marguerite observed day after day of consistent humanitarian care. The skepticism gave way to confusion, confusion to cautious acceptance, acceptance to something approaching understanding. Yet the American generosity was not without boundaries or purpose. The medical care was part of a larger strategy of denazification and reconstruction. The occupying forces understood that winning the peace required more than military victory. It required demonstrating to the German people that the democratic system they had been taught to despise was superior not just in material production but in moral architecture. The sulfa drugs were propaganda, but propaganda in the truest sense, truth deployed strategically. The Americans wanted Germans to recognize that their suffering in the war's final years, the scarcity, and starvation and medical neglect had been products of their own regime's failures and ideological distortions. By providing abundant care, American forces highlighted the bankruptcy of the Nazi system that had promised strength but delivered ruin. Marguerite's personal transformation mirrored a broader psychological shift occurring across occupied Germany. In her diary, discovered decades later among family papers, she recorded her evolving perceptions. In early May, she wrote with bitter resignation about the expected American occupation, assuming the worst based on 12 years of propaganda about ruthless enemy forces. By June, her entries reflected bewilderment. Why were they sharing drugs so freely? Why treat wounded SS men? By July, a different tone emerged, one of reluctant admiration mixed with shame. She wrote of watching Captain Morrison work 17-hour days treating German patients, of American nurses sharing their personal Red Cross parcels with hungry German staff, of the sulfa drugs that kept arriving in endless supply. She began to question how much of what she had been told about the enemy was true, and by extension, how much of what she had been told about her own government was false. The cognitive restructuring was painful, requiring her to confront complicity in a system she had served without sufficient questioning. The broader context of American pharmaceutical mobilization adds depth to this story. The United States' entry into World War II triggered the most rapid medical-industrial expansion in history. The military's medical department grew from fewer than 1,500 doctors in 1940 to over 50,000 by 1945. Pharmaceutical production expanded in parallel. Sulfa drug manufacturing, which had been a relatively modest industry in the late 1930s, became a major wartime priority. The government invested heavily in expanding production capacity, building new plants and subsidizing research into more effective sulfonamide derivatives. Sulfadiazine, sulfathiazole, and sulfaguanidine joined sulfanilamide in the medical arsenal, each optimized for different types of infection. The results were dramatic. American battlefield mortality rates from infected wounds were drastically lower than in previous wars. In World War I, infection had been a leading cause of death among wounded soldiers. By World War II, the combination of sulfa drugs, improved surgical techniques, and rapid evacuation systems reduced such deaths to a fraction of historical norms. This medical success story was fundamentally intertwined with American economic and political systems. The pharmaceutical companies that produced sulfa drugs operated under wartime regulations, but remained private enterprises motivated by profit. The government guaranteed markets and funded expansion, but the innovation and production efficiency came from competitive capitalism channeled toward national purpose. This hybrid model, neither purely free market nor purely state-controlled, demonstrated the flexibility of the American system. It could mobilize massive resources for collective goals while maintaining the innovative dynamism of private enterprise. The sulfa drugs that filled those cardboard boxes shipped to German hospitals were products of this system, bearing within their molecular structure the economic and political philosophy that had created them. For German nurses and doctors, witnessing this abundance was revelatory in ways that extended beyond immediate gratitude. The Nazi economy had promised autarky, self-sufficiency, a Germany independent of foreign resources. Yet the war had revealed this as fantasy. German synthetic fuel plants, chemical works, and pharmaceutical facilities had crumbled under Allied bombing and the regime's own mismanagement. The final months of war saw German forces desperately short of everything: ammunition, fuel, food, and medicine. The soldiers Marguerite treated in early 1945 often arrived with uniforms patched from scavenged materials, boots wrapped in rags, equipment improvised from desperation. The contrast with American material abundance was stark. American soldiers arrived with standardized gear, fresh supplies, and medical kits that included not just sulfa drugs, but morphine syrettes, bandages, antiseptics, and more. The ideological implication was unavoidable. The system that had promised strength through unity and racial purity had delivered weakness and scarcity. The system that supposedly wallowed in decadent individualism had produced unprecedented material abundance deployed for humanitarian purpose. The American decision to treat enemy wounded with full medical resources was not universally popular among American troops. Many GIs, having fought through years of brutal warfare, having lost friends to German bullets and artillery, questioned why they should expend precious resources on enemy soldiers. Captain Morrison faced this resistance in his own unit. Several medics initially refused to treat German prisoners with the same care afforded Americans. Morrison's response, recorded in his post-war memoir, reflected both pragmatic and principled reasoning. He argued that international law required proper treatment, that failure to uphold Geneva Conventions endangered American posts held by other nations, and that demonstrating American values in action was crucial to winning the peace. But beyond these practical arguments, he expressed a deeper conviction. The fight against Nazism was not merely a military conflict, but a battle between competing visions of human dignity. To descend to the cruelty they had fought against would be to admit that the ideological differences were superficial. Treating enemy wounded with humanity was not weakness, but the ultimate assertion of democratic values. This philosophy was tested severely in the summer of 1945 as American forces discovered the full scope of Nazi atrocities. The liberation of concentration camps in April and May had revealed horrors that shocked even battle-hardened soldiers. When American medics who had witnessed Dachau or Buchenwald were then required to treat SS guards and Wehrmacht soldiers, the moral tension became almost unbearable. How do you sprinkle sulfanilamide into the wound of a man who may have participated in genocide? How do you save the life of someone who served a regime dedicated to mass murder? The answers were neither simple nor satisfying. Some medics struggled with rage and the temptation to withhold care. Others compartmentalized, treating the enemy wounded as a medical task divorced from political judgment. But the official policy remained clear and was generally enforced. Medical care was not conditional upon moral worthiness. The wounded received treatment regardless of who they had been or what they had done. Marguerite witnessed these tensions play out in her hospital. She saw young American medics, barely out of their teens, treating elderly Volkssturm soldiers with professional efficiency while struggling visibly with their emotions. She observed the arrival of Jewish American soldiers whose families had escaped Germany in the 1930s, now returning in uniform to provide medical care to the very nation that had expelled them. The psychological complexity of these encounters defied simple narrative. One young medic from Brooklyn, whose parents had fled Berlin in 1938, told Marguerite through an interpreter that he hated what Germany had become but could not hate individual suffering humans. He distributed sulfa packets to wounded Germans while privately grieving for cousins who had perished in Theresienstadt. The moral landscape of post-surrender Germany was a terrain of contradictions. where the imperative to punish crimes coexisted uneasily with the imperative to rebuild a functioning society. The sulfanilamide that saved lives in those chaotic months was itself a reminder of scientific internationalism that transcended national boundaries. Domac's original research had built on earlier work by Austrian and British scientists. American pharmaceutical companies had licensed and improved upon German discoveries. The wartime sulfa drug program in the United States had involved scientists from multiple allied nations sharing research findings to accelerate development. Medicine, at its best, was a collaborative human enterprise that rendered national boundaries obsolete. The tragic irony was that Nazi Germany had rejected this scientific internationalism in favor of racial pseudoscience and autarky. German Jewish scientists who had contributed enormously to medical progress were expelled or murdered. International collaboration was denounced as Jewish cosmopolitanism. The regime that had pioneered sulfa drug research had ultimately failed to supply its own soldiers with adequate quantities, while the democratic coalition had fought against pooled knowledge and resources to produce abundance. As summer turned to autumn in 1945, the immediate crisis of the post-surrender period gave way to the longer process of occupation and reconstruction. The American military government began transitioning from emergency relief to establishing functioning civil administration. German hospitals were gradually returned to German management, though under American oversight. The flow of American medical supplies continued but was increasingly channeled through reconstituted German public health systems. Marguerite found herself working not as a conquered subject receiving charity, but as a professional colleague, collaborating with American medical personnel to rebuild healthcare infrastructure. The change was subtle but significant. The initial power dynamic of victor and vanquished evolved into something more nuanced, a partnership still deeply unequal but trending toward mutual respect. The sulfa drugs became less prominent as penicillin supplies increased and the pharmaceutical industry began recovering. But Marguerite never forgot those first cardboard boxes, never fully reconciled herself to how profoundly wrong her expectations had been. In her later diary entries from the 1950s and 60s, as West Germany was rebuilt into a prosperous democracy, she reflected on those early occupation months as a turning point not just in national history but in personal understanding. She wrote about the shame of having participated in a system that had valued lives differently, about the cognitive dissonance of witnessing enemy humanity after years of dehumanizing propaganda. She described the small white crystals of sulfanilamide as a symbol of what she had learned. That abundance could be generous, that strength could be merciful, that the most powerful assertion of values came not through rhetoric but through consistent action even when difficult. The broader lesson resonated beyond individual transformations. The American occupation of Germany, whatever its flaws and contradictions, demonstrated that victors need not become oppressors. The medical care extended to enemy populations was part of a larger Marshall Plan philosophy that rejected the punitive approach of Versailles in favor of reconstruction and reintegration. The generosity was strategic, calculated to prevent future conflict by creating prosperous democratic allies. But strategy does not negate sincerity. The Americans who distributed sulfa drugs to German hospitals believed genuinely in the principles they enacted. They were products of a culture that, despite its own serious flaws and hypocrisies, maintained at its core a commitment to human dignity that could extend across the boundaries of nationality and even recent enmity. The contrast with Soviet occupation policy in Eastern Germany made the American approach even more striking. German refugees fleeing from Soviet-controlled zones to American zones in 1945 and 1946 reported radically different treatments. Soviet forces, having suffered enormously at German hands and operating under a different ideological framework, often took a punitive approach. Factories were dismantled and shipped east as reparations. Food supplies were requisitioned for Soviet use even as German civilians starved. Medical care in Soviet zones was minimal, focused on Soviet personnel with German populations receiving only basic humanitarian assistance. The Americans, by contrast, implemented policies aimed at stabilization and eventual prosperity. The medical supplies distributed freely in 1945 were matched by food shipments, industrial recovery programs, and educational reforms. The sulfa drugs were just one element of a comprehensive effort to demonstrate democratic capitalism as superiority over both defeated fascism and emerging Soviet communism. Marguerite lived until 1983, long enough to see Germany reunited in democracy and prosperity, far exceeding anything she had known before the war. In an interview conducted in 1978 for an oral history project, she was asked what moment from her long nursing career stood out most clearly. She did not speak of dramatic surgical procedures or famous patients. She described instead that May morning in 1945, standing in a ruined schoolhouse holding an empty vial, watching American soldiers unload boxes marked with red crosses. She described the weight of those boxes, heavier than she expected, and the overwhelming relief mixed with confusion when she understood they were supplies, not confiscation notices. She spoke of Captain Morrison's Midwestern accent filtering through the interpreter, his matter-of-fact tone as he explained proper sulfa administration protocols for treating infected wounds. She remembered the first German patient she treated with American-supplied sulfanilamide after days of having nothing, a young soldier whose leg wound had been festering for a week. She recalled sprinkling the white powder into clean tissue, bandaging the site, and knowing with medical certainty that he would live rather than lose the limb to gangrene. That knowledge, she said, felt like emerging from a long darkness into unexpected light. The crystalline simplicity of sulfanilamide, its chemical formula Chandos, encoded a complexity of meaning in the context of post-war Germany. Molecules are politically neutral, yet the conditions of their production and distribution reveal everything about the societies that create and use them. The same compound that had been rationed by racial ideology in German hands became an instrument of democratic universalism in American hands. The transformation was not in the drug itself, but in the moral framework governing its use. This distinction matters profoundly when understanding how ideas translate into material reality. Nazi ideology had promised a society of strength and purity, but delivered scarcity and ruin because its foundational principles were false, disconnected from human nature and economic reality. American democracy, for all its imperfections and contradictions, rested on principles more aligned with actual human needs and capacities. The abundance of sulfa drugs was not accidental. It flowed from an economic system that, when mobilized for purpose, could produce unprecedented quantities of goods and distribute them according to principles that extended beyond narrow self-interest. In the 7 decades since Marguerite stood in that schoolhouse, the lessons of that encounter have been repeatedly tested and sometimes forgotten. Subsequent American conflicts would not always demonstrate the same commitment to enemy care. The idealism of 1945, born from a clear moral struggle against unambiguous evil, would prove difficult to sustain in more ambiguous wars. But the principle established then that victors bear responsibility for enemy wounded, that medicine transcends nationality, that humanitarian treatment of adversaries serves both moral and strategic purposes, remained embedded in military doctrine and international law. The Geneva Conventions were expanded and strengthened in 1949, partly in response to World War II experiences. The precedent of Nuremberg established that medical personnel could be held accountable for violations of humanitarian principles. The architecture of international humanitarian law that governs conflict today was shaped significantly by the lessons learned in the war's aftermath, including the recognition that caring for enemy wounded was not optional but obligatory. The sulfanilamide that saved lives in the spring and summer of 1945 has long since been superseded by more effective antibiotics. Penicillin and its descendants rendered sulfa drugs largely obsolete for most infections, though they retain niche applications. But the symbolic significance of those white crystals distributed so freely in German hospitals endures. They represent a moment when power was exercised with restraint, when abundance was deployed for humanitarian purpose, when enemies were treated as humans rather than abstractions. That moment was possible because individuals like Captain Morrison and institutions like the United States Army Medical Corps carried within them a set of values strong enough to withstand the hatreds generated by years of brutal warfare. Those values were not uniquely American, but in that specific historical moment, they were expressed through American power in ways that transformed expectations and rebuilt trust across the chasm of recent enmity. For Marguerite Hoffmann and countless Germans who experienced the American occupation, the boxes of medical supplies that arrived in those chaotic weeks after surrender became a reference point for understanding what democracy meant in practice. The concept had been so thoroughly distorted by Nazi propaganda, portrayed as weakness and decadence, that its actual manifestation was shocking. Democracy was not chaos but organized generosity. It was not weakness but sufficient strength to extend mercy. It was not material poverty but abundance so great it could be shared even with those who had recently been enemies. These were not lessons delivered through speeches or pamphlets but through concrete actions repeated consistently, enough to overcome skepticism. The American medic who treated a German soldier's infected wound with careful professionalism, who used precious antibiotics without hesitation, who demonstrated through medical care that human dignity transcended nationality, that medic was a more effective ambassador for democratic values than any propaganda campaign could have been. The story ends not with triumph but with reflection. The schoolhouse that served as Marguerite's hospital was eventually converted back to its original purpose, educating German children in a democracy rather than a dictatorship. The mathematical equations returned to the chalkboard, problems in arithmetic and geometry replacing the geometry of suffering. Captain Morrison returned to Minnesota, resumed his civilian medical practice, and rarely spoke about his wartime service except to insist that he had done only what was required and right. The sulfa drugs that seemed so miraculous in 1945 became routine, then obsolete, then historical curiosities remembered mainly by medical historians. But the principle they represented, that healing should be universal and that abundance carries moral responsibility, remained a quiet foundation of the international order built from the war's ruins. Somewhere in a German archive, Marguerite's diary entries rest among thousands of other personal testimonies from those years. Her handwriting, initially jagged with stress and fear, gradually becomes steadier through the summer of 1945, a physical record of psychological reconstruction. On the last page she wrote before her death, she returned to that May morning, that nearly empty vial, those unexpected boxes. She wrote that she had spent much of her life trying to understand how she could have been so wrong about so many things, how thoroughly propaganda could distort perception, how completely she had failed to question the system she served. But she wrote also about moments of grace, about the American captain who treated patients as humans rather than categories, about the white crystals that symbolized a different way of ordering the world. She wrote that she had learned the most important lessons not from books or lectures but from observing actions, from witnessing values expressed through daily practice rather than proclaimed rhetoric. The boxes of sulfa drugs, she wrote, had taught her more about democracy than any manifesto could have conveyed. The truth carried by those small packets of sulfanilamide powder was simpler and more profound than complex ideology. It said that human suffering demands response regardless of nationality. It said that a society's character is revealed not in how it treats friends, but how it treats enemies. It said that strength includes the capacity for mercy, that abundance carries obligation, that the moral test of power is how it acts when it could act otherwise. These are not easy truths. They require resisting the natural human impulse toward vengeance, the comfort of simple categories, the efficiency of selective compassion. But they are the truths upon which lasting peace must be built, the principles that allow former enemies to become partners in constructing better futures. In a world still struggling with these questions, still debating how to balance justice with mercy, and when to extend humanity across boundaries of conflict, the story of German nurses discovering American generosity in the spring of 1945 remains instructively relevant. Not as a simple morality tale of good triumphing over evil, but as a complex reminder that the highest expression of civilizational values comes not in victory speeches but in quiet acts of principled care when no one would have questioned a lesser choice.